So, basic premise today is that most leaders are not who we normally think of when we think of leaders. So most leaders are not CEOs, generals, prime ministers, politicians. I think it's probably safe to say in the UK at the moment, they're particularly not politicians. Despite what we're repeatedly told, leadership is not complicated. You don't need to spend years doing an MBA or working in a corporate boardroom or walking the corridors of Whitehall in order to understand it. And so what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about what I think leadership is, what it isn't, and some observations on how to do it and potentially how not to do it. I think the most damaging fallacy, to be honest, about leadership is that it is some exalted state, that there is some great secret knowledge only available to a chosen few. The reality is that everybody has the potential to lead, and as far as I'm concerned, anybody that has people who are dependent on them can consider themselves a leader. And in fact, in the UK, just if we consider the UK, we might think there's hundreds of thousands of people in leadership positions. Anybody who runs a Sunday league football team, a ward in a hospital, a department in a school, or a FTSE 100 company could consider themselves to be a leader. But the problem is there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum because we don't have enough good leaders. I mean, that is probably not that controversial a statement given what's happening in the country at the moment. So we don't have enough good leaders, certainly don't have enough great leaders, and nor do we have enough leaders from different sorts of backgrounds. And I think because great leadership changes lives. We've all experienced working with great leaders, and great leadership changes lives. And there's a great quote that I love that captures the role us everyday people play, if you like, in society. And somewhat implausibly, it's from George Eliot, and I'm going to read it to you. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. And if I could be so bold, I did a degree in engineering, so I'm very happy to fuck around with the classics a little bit. It doesn't bother me too much. So if I could just rewrite George Eliot slightly for the purpose of my presentation today and say the growing good of the world is mostly dependent on unhistoric leaders. That is why things are not so ill with you and me as they might otherwise have been. So my next 15 minutes of my presentation is about us everyday leaders and how we can do it better. If you remember one thing from my presentation today, I'd say it's this, that leadership is difficult but not complicated. But there is an entire swathe, a mega industry dedicated to telling us the opposite. Management consultants, business schools, books, blogs, videos, dare I say, conferences. The leadership industrial complex. In the first instance, most of it's snake oil, bullshit, okay? And why does this matter? It matters because it creates a perception of an elite, an untouchable knowledge. But it also causes two problems. Problem one, this bullshit gets in the way of people who are currently in leadership positions. It gets in the way of them fulfilling their potential because the subject is all smeared in this bullshit and they don't, they overcomplicate it, don't fulfill what they could achieve. But second, potentially a bigger issue is that it actually excludes people from aspiring to be leaders at all. Because it says, actually, no, leadership isn't something for people like me. It's not something that I can aspire to. And it's a big problem for us. And so leadership isn't a science, it's an art. It's a craft. And I think, so to understand it, it's worth thinking about how artists talk about their craft. So Dali was asked how difficult it is to create a masterpiece. And he said, well, it's either simple or it's impossible. And Michelangelo asked a similar question. I think this is probably slightly apocryphal, but when he was asked, how did you turn this block of raw stone into David? He said, well, I just chipped away all the bits that didn't look like David. And I think what we learn from that is, or what we can take from that, is that leadership is rather similar. Leadership is very simple in theory, but very difficult in practice. So let's have a look at what leadership is then. So 2 observations. First of all, what is a leader? Well, as I said, in my opinion, a leader is anybody who has people who are dependent on them. And what is leadership? Well, I think leadership is this. Leadership is the activity concerned with the navigation of a group of people from a start point in the present to a different and simply defined state that exists in the future. That's all leadership is. And so let's break that into its constituent parts. So in order to lead, you need to ask yourself 2 questions. You need to be able to understand your start point. The leadership industrial complex will tell you this is quite a difficult thing to do. It's not. It's really easy. I could come and talk to each of you and ask you whether you play in a sports team or whether you run a team in your business or whether you run an entire business. And we could have a chat for 10 minutes about what do you think are the big challenges that your business face. And you could tell me really simply, really clearly, no problem. This is easy. Don't let anybody tell you it isn't. It's important, but it's easy. Now, the second question, though, hang on. The second question is, where do you want to be? And this is what the leadership industry gets you to spend millions and millions and millions of pounds on, because this is where visions, missions, big, hairy, audacious goals, cultures, values, this is where this all exists. And we're told that this is a really, really difficult and complicated thing to do, and it's really not. This is just an objective. This is just a direction. Don't let anybody tell you this is difficult. This is really complicated. I have been involved with, and I have, to my shame, led leadership teams that honestly have never got beyond this point. I guarantee you people in the room will have had that same experience. Don't let anybody tell you it's difficult. It's not. It's just an objective. Write it simply. Most of the time, most of our task is just to outperform our competition. Don't overcomplicate it. Now, this bit though, so this isn't leadership. This is PowerPoint slides. Leadership is the journey between the 2 points. And the journey between the 2 points is really, really difficult. And that's what a leader does. And so let's have a think about the 4 observations, therefore, if you like, about what a leader does. So how do you get between those 2 points? Well, it's the life-changing power of getting stuff done. That's what leaders do, to be able to get stuff done. And I think I mentioned earlier that I have a degree in engineering, so I've written a COD equation about this, which I'm well qualified to say has no scientific basis whatsoever, but I'll explain why I've written it. Traveling along that journey is about creating impact. Leadership is about creating impact. And impact has 2 components. It's all the stuff that they talk about in management consultants and business schools and conferences. It's all the business school stuff here. And then there's action. And you know what? Guess what? Well, that's quite easy. Nobody really gets fired for writing PowerPoint presentations. You have to write a really bad PowerPoint presentation to get fired. But action is really hard. But the real point of this equation is this. That's why I wrote it as an equation, because anything times 0 is 0. So you can spend as much, you can be as clever as you like here, you can write the world's most genius strategy, but if you don't actually manage to get anything done, you're going to create no impact, you're not going to get anywhere. And conversely, by the way, you can be imperfect here, and by the way, you will be imperfect. Imperfection is an absolute guarantee. You can be imperfect here, create lots of action, you'll create lots of impact. Leadership is not a straight line process. Leadership is a zigzag, bumpy journey, and that's the best you can hope for. Most leaders never move anywhere because they don't create any impact. So how do we create impact? We make decisions. Now, I think making decisions is a bit like driving, in the sense that virtually nobody ever admits to being a bad driver, but anybody who's actually been in a car knows that the majority of people are bad drivers. It's the same with making decisions. Virtually nobody will admit to being indecisive, and yet we have all experienced working with and working for profoundly indecisive people, and we all know how frustrating that process is. I've, again, been in and led leadership teams, or any sort of team, where every week we sit and discuss the same problem. People in the room right now will be recognizing that. Every week you sit and discuss the same problem. Nothing is more debilitating for a leader or a team or a leadership group as the inability to take decisions. And without taking decisions, you get nothing done. And why? Why is that? I think there's two reasons why people don't make decisions. The first is they worry about getting stuff wrong. I think the answer to learning how to make decisions is to reframe your fear. You have to accept the inevitability of error. You just have to accept it. It's no matter what happens, you will fuck up, you will get stuff wrong. As soon as you accept the inevitability of error, it's kind of liberating, because then you need to shift your fear from a fear of getting stuff wrong to a fear of not making enough decisions. Because not making decisions is what causes you to fail as a leader. And in reality, most decisions that you have to make are not right or wrong anyway. It's blue pill, red pill. It's left door, right door. You can't even tell retrospectively whether it was the right decision. It's just take a fucking decision. And you open the left door, and beyond the left door, what's behind it? A row of other doors stretching into the distance. You open the right door, what's behind that door? A row of other doors stretching into the distance. You have to just make decisions. And the second reason I think people delay is they think that if they wait long enough, there'll be some sort of silver bullet insight will appear and give them the answer. And of course, that doesn't ever happen. So I think a good rule of thumb is, this is Colin Powell's 40-70 rule. So Colin Powell said, don't take action if you have only enough information to give you a less than 40% chance of being right. And if you've waited until you're more than 70% certain, you've waited too long. So he's saying two things, really. He's saying, one, don't just shoot from the hip. Don't just turn up and just go, yeah, whatever, we'll do whatever. I mean, think about it a bit. But he's also saying, wait too long, and that's fatal as well. He's also, this says, you need to get used to living with ambiguity. Because actually what this says is, effectively accept that at least 3 out of 10 are going to be wrong. But that is preferable to not taking decisions at all. One other thing I want to talk about related to this is, because this is a conference about leadership and about creativity, I bet these words are going to get used quite a lot over these 2 days. Nimble and agile. Who doesn't want to be nimble and agile? Yeah, we all want to be nimble and agile, right? Fucking great. And we do. But the question really for a leader is, what do I have to do in order to be nimble and agile? No, it's not a trivial question. What behaviors do you need in order to create a nimble and agile organization? It's definitely not write PowerPoint presentations, and it's definitely not write processes. Nimbleness and agility are about decision-making, and they're about decision-making cultures. And this is a bit of a mouthful, but effectively, the only way you can create a nimble and an agile culture is accept as a leader that decisions will get taken at a distance from you without reference to you, i.e., other people make decisions on their own. That is the only way. If you have an organization where somebody over there, in order for them to decide, has to come and ask you, that is a top-down hierarchical organization. It is impossible to be nimble and agile. This is the only way. So for a leader, you have to get used to not being a control freak. You have to get used to trusting people and creating an environment where you actively encourage people to make decisions without coming and talking to you about them first. That's what nimbleness and agility is. Anything other than that isn't going to be, at least if you employ more than 5 people. But if you only employ 5 people and you're not nimble and agile, I mean, what the fuck are you doing? So that takes us to culture. So for a leader, I think arguably the most important thing you need to do is create an effective culture. A culture really is superpower as a leader. So I remember when I first became a CEO, I became a CEO of a pretty shit business. And I remember standing in the agency thinking, well, okay, so we're a bit shit, but those people half a mile down the road, they're in the same industry as us and they're really good. So why, I'm just in a building with people in it and they're in a building with people in it, and why is their building with people in it better than my building with people in it? I mean, that applies to nearly all of our situations. And the answer isn't rocket science, the answer is just talent and culture. And the most important of those two is culture. And culture is the environment the leader creates in order to allow their people to outperform. Culture isn't Pilates at lunchtime and 2 kinds of soya milk in the cafe. Culture is a hard, physical, competitive advantage. Culture is the thing the leader does to to make his or her team outperform the competition. But there's a lot of cynicism attached to culture. And the reason there's a lot of cynicism is because I think cynicism exists in direct proportion to the gap between what you say and what you do. The bigger the gap between your words and your deeds, by the way, this doesn't just apply to leadership, this is just true. That's what cynicism is. And the reason cynicism exists around culture is companies talk a good game and their behavior has no correlation at all to what they say that actually matters to them. So in most organizations, the things carved into the bronze plaque in reception bear little relation to the actual culture in the organization. And that's because essentially culture is the behavior of management. Now, this is good news for a leader because that means your behavior can directly and immediately create the culture you want, as long as your behavior is consistent with that. So the leader has to think with their team really hard about what kind of culture they want, and they then have to ask themselves, what behaviors do I need to exhibit in order to make that happen? Let's go back to that conversation about decisions. That's a culture-based conversation, right? What behaviors does the leader need to exhibit in order to allow people the freedom to make decisions without coming back and talking to them? That's a classic cultural question for a leader. And in fact, you don't need to write anything down. It's better if you do, but if you have to choose between walking the walk and not writing it down and behaving completely differently, go with behavior. So culture is the behavioral management. Get it right. It's a superpower. Virtually impossible to copy. I'm going to skip that because I haven't got a lot of time. Oh, no, I could do it quickly. This is a slide about leadership requires people to follow you. Okay, essentially. You can't be a leader if people aren't going to follow you. And again, it's a huge subject in itself, as is culture. But the key thing, I think, for a leader is to remember that the most successful teams manage to align the individual ambitions of the people in that team, all of which will be different because everybody's different, but the people in that team need to be able to see how the team meeting its objective is completely in line with them fulfilling their own objectives. So they can fulfill their own objectives at the same time as the team fulfilling its objectives. Now that isn't just financial, that isn't just career-based, that could be, do you know what, I want to be able to work 3 days a week and have 2 days a week over there to go and pursue my own projects. But while I'm there with that team for those 3 days, I'm going to really give my all because I know that in doing that, I get the freedom to do what I want. But aligning individual objectives with team objectives is how you get a high-performance team. And then the final thing is really a quote. My fourth point is about what it's actually like to be a leader. And the fact, frankly, to be a leader is just really, really fucking hard work. There's not a way around that. It's incredibly exciting. It can change people's lives. It really does. It changes people's lives around you. It can change your life, but it's hard work and it's tough. And failure, it's easy for me to flippantly say, don't worry about getting decisions wrong. Tell you what, it's fucking horrible when it happens. So you have to be tough. You have to be resilient. And I think this is one of my favorite quotes about resilience. I'll read it out to you. This is by the actor Will Smith, by the way. And he said, "The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill. I will not be outworked, period. You might have more talent than me. You might be smarter than me. You might be sexier than me. You might be all of those things. You've got it on me in 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, there's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die." So, not suggesting that you need to die in order to be a leader, just to be clear. But I do think you need an essence of this resilience in order to be an effective leader. Thank you for listening. That's my presentation.
Thanks very much.
I don't know if we have time for any questions, do we, or not?
Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you for the talk, firstly. Really inspiring. I just wondered, have you got any tips for someone that's not in a managerial position, and how can they start to show leadership traits or start to lead from that position?
Well, I think first of all, like I say, anybody that has, I mean, I don't know your exact position, but anybody that has anybody who is responsible, who they are responsible for, is, in a sense, the most important person in those people's lives. And so therefore can consider themselves to be a leader. And certainly that my point about the sort of the unhistoric acts is that hundreds of thousands of us are in those positions. Okay, I mean, I've worked in advertising all my career. I mean, when I was an account manager, after about 1 year, I had account execs working for me. I would never have considered myself a leader, but in truth, in a way, I was. So I think, first of all, I think it's getting into the mindset that actually these principles apply to everybody, and being good at these. You know, everybody in any form of leadership position, by getting to a place where you can follow all of this. You can, with your team, you can talk about what are we trying to achieve as a team. This isn't just all about big international businesses. So I think these principles apply to anybody who has people who they are responsible for. And I think if you follow these, if you're working, well, frankly, it doesn't even have to be in a working environment, but I presume you're talking about a working environment. If you're in a working environment, if you follow these principles, your teams will outperform. And if your teams outperform, that's how you get more responsibility.
Anybody else?
Hi, thanks for that insightful talk. My name is Dee Dee. I'd just like to ask you just an open-ended question, open question and an open...
Sorry, it's very difficult to hear.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think what constitutes to being a good leader is excellent listening skills? And what do you think...
I think
listening skills are the key to leadership?
Well, I don't know if they are the key. I think they are one of the keys. I think yes, you need to be able to listen. And I think a lot of leaders don't. I mean, when I talked about those two start and end points, in the book, I talk about how important it is that actually that certainly the understanding where your start point is primarily about listening. But I think listening is important, but you have to create an environment where people are able to be honest with you. There's no point listening if people are just telling you what you want to hear. And I think so it's more than just being able to listen. It's actually being able to create an environment where people tell you the things you don't want to hear. I think that is really important for a leader, because a lot of leaders surround themselves with people who tell them only the things they think the leader does want to hear. So it's listening, but it's creating a cultural environment where sometimes that listening is a bit difficult, frankly. If you're just surrounded by people who tell you what you want to hear, you're going to fail because you're not hearing the right things.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.